I moved into the flat in early spring. Ground floor, end of a small block, reasonably priced for the area. The letting agent showed me around. I signed the papers 3 days later, and by the following weekend, I was in. It was the kind of place that needed a bit of work, but nothing serious. I was happy enough with it. The neighbor directly next to me was a man in his 50s called Graham. He introduced himself on my second day there, knocked on my door with a friendly smile, and told me if I ever needed anything to just ask. He seemed completely normal, quiet, polite, the kind of neighbor you're glad to have. He mentioned he'd lived there for about 7 years and knew the building well. I remember thinking I'd got lucky with him. About 3 weeks in, I noticed something slightly odd. I came home from work one afternoon, and as I was putting my key in the door, I noticed a small scratch mark near the lock that I was fairly sure hadn't been there before. It was faint, the kind of thing most people wouldn't look twice at. I ran my finger over it and told myself it was probably just from my own keys catching the plate over time. I went inside and forgot about it. The following week I came home, and something felt different in the flat. I couldn't explain it, and I couldn't point to anything specific. Everything looked exactly where I'd left it. But there was just something in the air that felt slightly off, the way a room feels when someone has been in it recently, even though you can't see any evidence of it. I stood in the hallway for a minute, just looking around, and then told myself I was being ridiculous and went to make a cup of tea. But I started leaving small signs after that. Nothing obvious, just little things to check when I got home. I'd leave a piece of paper just slightly overlapping the edge of a drawer. I'd leave my bedroom door at a specific angle. Small, easy things that I would notice if they'd been disturbed. I felt a bit silly doing it, but I couldn't shake the feeling, so I did it anyway. 2 weeks later, I came home, and the bedroom door was at the wrong angle. I stood in the hallway staring at it. The piece of paper by the drawer was fine. Nothing else seemed different, but the door was definitely not where I'd left it. I know because I'd started taking a photo of it on my phone each morning before I left, just to be certain I wasn't second-guessing myself. I pulled up the photo and held my phone up next to the door, and it was off by several inches. Someone had opened that door and pulled it back, but not to exactly where it had been. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay there going over every possibility, trying to find an explanation that made sense. I thought about the letting agent, whether they had any reason to be doing checks. I thought about maintenance, whether anyone had been sent in for something. I rang the letting agency the next morning and asked directly whether anyone had been in my flat. They checked their records and said no, absolutely not. No visits had been arranged, and no one had been given access. I bought a small doorbell camera that same day and fitted it to face the front door from the inside. It was a cheap one, but it recorded movement and saved it to my phone. 4 days later, I got a notification at 1:30 in the afternoon while I was sitting at my desk at work. I opened the app and watched the footage, and my stomach just dropped. The front door opened. A key went in the lock. The door swung open, and Graham from next door walked in. He didn't rush. He walked in like it was completely normal, like he'd done it 100 times before, and went straight towards the hallway without even pausing. He was in the flat for 11 minutes. He came out carrying nothing, locked the door behind him, and walked back to his own flat. I called the police from the office toilet with my hands shaking. Not shaking from fear exactly, more from the shock of seeing it so plainly, so casually, like it was nothing. The police arrested Graham that same evening. When they searched his flat, they found a duplicate key to my front door and keys to 2 other flats in the building as well. he had been in those flats too. The way the officer explained it to me afterwards was that Graham had at some point got hold of the master key that the building's old maintenance man used to carry, a man who had left the job 2 years earlier. Graham had copies made before returning it, and had simply been letting himself into flats in the building whenever the tenants were out. Not always to take things, sometimes just to look around, to go through people's belongings, to be in someone else's space. A couple of small things had gone missing from the other flats over the months. Nothing valuable. A watch, some cash, small enough that the tenants had assumed they'd just misplaced them. He had been doing it for at least 18 months, according to the police, which meant he had been in those flats dozens of times before anyone knew. He'd been doing it to my flat for the entire 3 weeks I'd lived there. The thing that bothers me most isn't the break-ins themselves. It's that he knocked on my door on my second day and smiled and said if I ever needed anything to just ask. He was helpful and friendly. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he stood there and looked me in the eye without any hesitation at all. I moved out within the month. I don't think I could have stayed, even if I'd wanted to. I got home from work on a Friday evening, changed out of my work clothes, and ordered a pizza. That was my whole plan for the night. Eat, watch something, go to sleep. I'd had a long week, and I wasn't in the mood for anything else. The pizza came. I ate it on the sofa, and at some point around 10, I turned the TV off and went upstairs. I remember checking my phone for a bit, and then falling asleep pretty quickly. Nothing about that night felt unusual in any way. The next morning, I came downstairs and noticed my front door was unlocked. Not the deadbolt, just the latch, the simple one that locks automatically when you pull the door shut. It wasn't locked. I stood there for a second trying to think back to the night before, whether I'd come back in after putting the pizza box in the outside bin and maybe not pulled the door properly. I was fairly sure I had, but I was tired, and I let it go. What I couldn't let go was what I found about a week later. I was doing a clear out one Sunday afternoon, just going through some cupboards, and I moved a jacket that had been hanging on the hook behind my bedroom door for months. Behind the jacket, sitting on the little wooden shelf above the hook, was a phone. Not my phone. A small, cheap, basic phone, the kind you can buy for next to nothing, a pay-as-you-go type. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands and just stood there completely confused. I had no idea where it had come from or how long it had been there. I turned it on. It had battery, which meant at some point someone had charged it. There was nothing on it. No messages, no call history, no photos, completely wiped or never used. But it had been placed deliberately on that shelf, behind my jacket, in my bedroom. Someone had put it there on purpose. I sat on the edge of my bed and just stared at it. I wasn't panicking. I was just trying to make sense of it. Had someone been in my house? Had someone walked into my bedroom and put this phone behind my jacket on purpose? And if they had, when and why? I rang my brother, and he came over and looked at the phone and looked at where I'd found it, and he went quiet in a way that made me more uneasy than if he'd said something. He said we should call the police, which I did. The officer who came out was straightforward about it. He said a cheap, unregistered phone hidden behind something in a bedroom was sometimes used as a listening device, paired with another phone, so that someone could call the number and listen to whatever was happening in the room through the microphone. It didn't need any special software, just 2 cheap phones and someone who knew the person's routine. He said it was more common in domestic situations, ex-partners, that kind of thing, but not always. That hit me in a way I wasn't ready for, because I had broken up with someone about 3 months before this, It hadn't ended well. He had been to my house before. He knew the layout. He knew which key I kept under the mat outside the back door for emergencies, a habit I'd had for years and had never thought twice about. I hadn't spoken to him since the breakup. He hadn't made any threats, hadn't shown up anywhere, nothing obvious. But looking back over those 3 months, I started thinking about small things I'd brushed off. A car parked on my street that I vaguely recognized, but told myself I was imagining. A couple of times I came home and felt like something in the house was slightly different, but couldn't say exactly what. Once I was sure I'd left my bedroom curtains open and came home to find them half closed. I'd convinced myself I was just tired and forgetful. The police spoke to him. He denied everything. There was no way to prove the phone was his because it had never been registered and had no data on it. Without being able to connect it to him directly, there wasn't much that could be done, which the officer explained to me as clearly and as gently as he could. He said to keep a record of anything else that seemed off, and to get in touch immediately if anything escalated. I had the locks changed that same weekend. I got rid of the spare key from under the mat. I asked my neighbor to keep an eye on the street and told her roughly what had happened without going into all the details. Nothing happened after that. No more strange cars. No more curtains half closed. Nothing out of place. Whether he stopped because the police spoke to him or because I changed the locks and he couldn't get in anymore, I don't know. What I think about is how long it was there. That phone, sitting behind my jacket on that shelf in my bedroom while I went about my normal life, getting changed, going to sleep, talking on my own phone. I moved that jacket maybe once in 3 months. It could have been there the whole time. I'll never know exactly what he heard. And that's the part that stays with me. It all started on a random Wednesday. I came home from work, made some toast, sat on the sofa and watched whatever was on TV. Nothing special, just a normal evening. I remember being tired and thinking about going to bed early. That was it. The only thing that felt slightly odd was that when I walked into the kitchen to put my plate in the sink, I noticed the small window above it was open. Not wide open, just cracked. Maybe an inch or two. I'm almost certain I hadn't left it open that morning, but I'd been rushing to get out the door, and I wasn't completely sure. I closed it, washed my plate, and went to bed. I didn't think about it again. The next evening I came home, and everything seemed fine. I made dinner, did a bit of tidying, and was about to sit down when I went to grab my phone charger from the kitchen counter, and noticed it wasn't where I'd left it. It was still in the kitchen, just on the other side of the counter, near the toaster, instead of near the kettle. Again, the kind of thing that on its own means nothing. You move things without thinking. You forget. I put it back where I usually keep it and got on with my evening. But I started paying more attention after that. Not in a panicked way, but just in a quiet, background kind of way. The sort of attention where you start noticing small things you'd normally walk straight past. 2 days later, I noticed one of my kitchen drawers wasn't fully closed. It was the drawer where I keep random stuff, batteries, takeaway menus, a spare phone cable, that kind of thing. It was open about 2 centimeters, like someone had gone through it and pushed it shut in a hurry without checking it properly. I stood there looking at it for a second, and that was the first time I felt something I couldn't quite explain. Like something was quietly wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what. I mentioned it to my neighbor, an older woman called Pat, who I chat to sometimes over the fence. I wasn't even sure why I told her. I just needed to say it out loud to someone. She listened, and then said something that stopped me completely. She told me she'd seen a man standing in my back garden 2 evenings ago. She'd assumed it was a friend of mine. He was just standing near the back fence, she said, looking at the house. She hadn't thought anything of it at the time. That's when I went and checked the back gate properly for the first time. The latch was fine, but when I looked closer at the lock, the small padlock I kept on it was hanging open. I always lock that padlock. I do it out of habit every time I come through the gate. It was open, and I hadn't opened it. I called a locksmith that same afternoon and had new locks put on the back gate and the back door. While he was there, I told him what had been happening, and he asked if anyone else had a key to the property. I said no, just me. He looked at the back door lock and told me it was an old and very common type, one that a lot of people have copied keys for without realizing, especially in older rented properties. He said in his experience, sometimes when tenants move out, they hold on to a spare key without handing it back, and sometimes they share it with people who really shouldn't have it. I rang my landlord and asked him directly whether the locks had been changed before I moved in. He went quiet for a second, and then said he thought they had been, but he wasn't completely sure. Which basically meant no. The police came out, took a note of everything, and said there wasn't much they could do without more evidence. They said it could be someone who used to live there and still had access, possibly coming in to look for something they'd left behind, or just to see what was there. They said it happened more than people realized. They said to keep my doors locked and to get the locks changed, which I'd already done. Nothing was ever taken or broken. I never came face to face with anyone. From the outside, it probably sounds like nothing even happened. Just a few small things slightly out of place. A gate left unlocked. A neighbor seeing someone in a garden. But someone had a key to my house and was coming in while I was at work and going through my kitchen drawers and standing in my back garden looking up at the windows. For how long that had been going on before I started noticing, I honestly don't know. I still live there. The locks are new, and I check everything before I leave every morning. Pat next door has my number now, and I've asked her to ring me if she ever sees anyone in the garden again. She hasn't. At least not yet.